This is exciting.
It's different.
It's different, yes, but it's exciting. We're back to the two-man format, and I'm in the driver's seat now.
Yes, you are.
I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Gary does not agree. Well, you know I'm on your left side. So from where you're sitting, I'm on the driver's side. Gary, look it. They gave me this. I got the clicker. Oh.
You are large and in charge.
Well, I'm half that. Okay, so we are jumping right in to you and me doing class together.
Okay.
And you know, me and Gary had a rapport.
Yes. Well, we've worked into this. You did some, then I did some, and now we're finally together.
Yes. So we're dipping our toes in tonight to see how it goes.
And see, you've already started out using those big words that I don't understand, like rapport.
Rapport.
Yeah.
It's only 2 syllables. So if, you know, any criticisms tonight after our inaugural run can be directed towards Johnny. And
I was going to say Gary because he left.
He is here too. Yeah, he'll be the one with the criticisms and advice to offer. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, what are we talking about tonight? See, Gary always did that to me.
See, well, we are talking about the wise man and the foolish man.
Yes,
eventually,
we are.
But not right off the bat. So
yes, so we are wrapping up the Sermon on the Mount, which we've been kind of going back and picking up the pieces that we missed from the Sunday morning study as it went through and kind of cherry picked some things out of the Sermon on the Mount. We've gone back and picked up the parts that we missed, and we're finishing that up tonight. So we're going to finish up chapter 7, the last half of chapter 7, verses 13 through 29. And do we need to give a recap on where we've been? Sermon on the Mount?
Yes. Okay,
so Sermon on the Mount starts with the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, and kind of a standard for Christian living in the Beatitudes. Here's how you ought to behave. Here's how you ought to live. Here's the attitudes you ought to have. Those kind of things. And what it should look like then is what follows after that. This is if you're gonna be people who are doing the Beatitudes or living the Beatitudes, then what does that look like? Well, you're going to be people who are salt and light. And then Jesus concludes that section with that statement that we spent quite a bit of time on in chapter 5, verse 20, about our righteousness being greater than that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And Jesus spends the rest of chapter 5 talking about what that means. You have heard that it was said this, but I say unto you this. And so he has that contrast between what the scribes and the Pharisees said about how to live versus how he is calling his disciples to live.
He's contrasting between physically doing stuff and the fact that he wants this in your heart.
Right.
For you to have these teachings in your heart. And if your heart's not right, then you've already done these things.
Yeah, and the actions have to match the heart, and the actions without the heart are irrelevant, and the heart without the actions also irrelevant, and we're going to see that probably more tonight as well. So then in chapter 6 he gets into some daily living things about what it means to actively in a daily way live out the things that he's talking about with giving and with praying and fasting, and then his cure for anxiety at the end of chapter 6 is a wonderful passage. Seek first his kingdom. And then last week you covered judging, and were you in favor of it or against it?
We're in favor of doing it the correct way.
Okay, there we go. So Jesus does condemn judging in an inappropriate way, but we also looked at, or you led through some passages that also talked about appropriate ways of judging, which the Bible is very specific about, that we are able to look at the things that people do and make judgments about their actions and weigh those against Scripture and judge those against Scripture and see if their actions are correct or not. But it's that inappropriate judging that Jesus condemns here about harsh judgment and about judging in a hypocritical way. So that leads us to, that was a quick recap.
Yes.
But we're going to run out of time tonight anyway, so so we got to get started on the part that we're in. So we're going to look at verses 13 through 29 tonight, and we're going to start with verses 13 through 14. So verses 13 and 14 say, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it." And I kind of forgot the starting questions at the beginning.
Oh.
Talks about the wise man built his house upon the rock. Do you remember that song? When was the last time you sung that song?
5 minutes.
It's 5 minutes ago. That was a great introduction. And we want to really be people who make wise decisions and follow the things that Jesus said. We're going to talk about that. Here's a great question. This is my favorite one of the introductory questions here. Is it possible to know God and do good works and still not make it to heaven?
He tells us that. We can't miss the mark.
Think about that for a minute. So think about the idea of knowing God, doing good works, even in his name, but still in the end not making it to heaven. That's a sobering thought, but we will deal with that one tonight as we look through the text. And then the third one is just a general question. Think about the judgment day. Think about what that's going to look like, what's going to happen. And as we work through the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, we will talk some about that tonight. Now, verses 13 and 14, which I already read. So, how many gates are there?
2.
Good answer. Good answer. And where do they lead?
One of them leads to heaven and one of them leads to hell.
One leads to destruction, and the other leads to life. And if there are 2 gates, and one leads to destruction and one leads to life, how many ways out of that scenario do we have? Like, I don't like those 2 choices, so I'm going to choose option.
No, you don't have any options.
Okay.
You've got one choice. Are you going to go left or right?
Okay. Are you going to go up or down? Left
Yep.
or right? Broad or narrow? Okay, so
Goats or sheep?
goats or sheep, Matthew 25. So are you sure? Because that seems not very nice in our politically correct agenda today.
That's correct. Everybody seems to think that they ought to have any choice they want to, but the scriptures tell us you got one.
And it doesn't matter how much I like that scenario. It doesn't matter if I like it, if I agree with it, if I want to participate or if I don't want to participate. Jesus is laying it out. This is the way it is.
Scriptures tell us you've made the choice whether you believe you've made it or not. You've either decided to follow God or you're not following God.
Mm-hmm.
And the choice, you have that choice, but you've made it.
Right. And so, but we really don't need to worry too much about it because pretty much it's hard to get on that road that leads to destruction, right?
Oh no. Oh no. It's wide and easy.
That's the wide and easy way. It's the narrow, difficult way that leads to life. Is that fair?
It's righteous.
It's okay. It's righteous. All right. I like that response.
Well, it's God's standards, and God is always there. He gives
Okay.
us what is
It's God's standards, and God's standards are always fair, or always, I could go with that. They're always righteous for sure.
I wonder too, is the gate that's narrow really more difficult?
Well, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, that our light momentary affliction leads to an eternal weight of glory that far outshines it all. So in hindsight, in looking back, for sure, as we look back, if we attain life in the end, then we'll look back and say, that wasn't hard at all. That was worth it. That was worth every moment.
And Jesus did say,
Yeah.
my burden is light.
My yoke is easy, my burden is light.
And so the choice is stark.
Yeah.
And so I think making the right first step can be, in our mind, difficult, but Jesus is telling us that it's not a hard step.
And I think you're right. And the idea of Jesus saying, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, has to do with the idea of do we carry the burden of our own sin, which is very heavy and hard to bear, and in the end leads to destruction, or do we allow him to carry that burden for us, which then we take on his righteousness and he takes on our sin. Well, which would you rather carry, the righteousness of Christ or the burden of your own sin? In that sense, it is a much easier road to take. But in the sense that I think he's talking about here, when you look at the things that he's taught about through the Sermon on the Mount, you don't have to do anything to be on the narrow road. I mean, you can ignore everything. You can do nothing and be on the narrow road. That sounds very easy, doing nothing. But in order to, the wide road. I said that backwards. You don't have to do anything to be on the wide road. But in order to be on the narrow road, you have to commit to the life that he's calling his disciples to live, which is a greater righteousness and a more how does he say it back in chapter 5, verse 20? Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Imagine the burden that the scribes and the Pharisees put on the people, and here Jesus says, I'm going to take it a step further. Well, that can sound harsh, that can sound difficult, even though really he was calling them to, as you've already said, an easier life than what the scribes and the Pharisees were calling them to.
Well,
The narrow road is purposeful.
Yes, it's got a purpose. It's purposeful and it's meaningful, and it takes the decision. Yes.
I like the word find. You have to find it, and maybe the broad way is easier because you're kind of, I don't know.
You don't have to find it.
No
It's that
purpose,
you're.
I guess.
Yeah. If you don't do anything, you're on it. And if you want to be on the narrow road, you have to find it.
I think that's
Yeah.
kind of goes to the purpose and intent as
Yeah.
well.
I think that's a real good key is that the promise is that we seek him, we'll find him.
Yeah.
But there is, you have to seek in order
Yeah.
to find. And if you do nothing or just follow the path that everybody else is doing instead of seeking the Lord, then that is a broad way.
Right. That's exactly right.
Luke 13, starting in verse 22, says, And he went through the cities and the villages, teaching and journeyed through Jerusalem. Then one said to him, Lord, are there few who will be saved? And he said to them, Strive to enter through the narrow gate, for many, I say to you, will seek to enter and will not be able. So he's saying that there's going to be, they want to go in, but they're not seeking the right way to go in.
Right. They're taking the wrong road and think it's going to lead to the right gate.
Correct.
And it won't. They'll be at the wrong gate when they get there. And that is, a comment I wrote down here. Few on the wide road believe that they're headed in the wrong direction. If you take a poll of those that are on the wide road, most of them would believe that they're headed in the right direction. And that to me is the most sobering and scariest part of the whole thing. There's probably very few people on that wide road that say, yeah, I know where I'm headed and it's okay. So it's a sobering thought. Verses 15 to 20 carry on here. He is building on this thought. Says, beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then, you will know them by their fruits. Well, what do you know about fruit?
Some taste good, some taste bad.
Yes, I agree. He starts off by warning them about false prophets. Is that something we have to worry about?
Yes.
Okay, good answer.
I mean, he tells his disciples
Right.
that that they need to be wary because there's others, in Mark 13, he tells them there's going to be others saying that the Christ has come, and don't go out there because he hasn't.
Yeah.
So don't listen to those people.
Yep. I think it's Acts chapter 4 where Gamaliel talks about, those that, he's telling the council that if these men are, if Christ is real, then we can't stop him. But if he's not real, then we don't need to stop him because it'll fizzle out.
He'll fall on his face.
So we know that other false Christs had come along, that other people claiming to be messiahs had come and that they had been thwarted. Acts chapter 20, Paul's warning to the Ephesian elders is that there would be those arise even from their own number who would lead the sheep astray. And so we know that false prophets are a thing, and that they were something they had to worry about back then. They're also something we have to worry about now, and that comes right back to the idea of judging that we talked about just a minute ago, that if we're going to listen to the teaching of others, we need to judge that teaching. You all need to be judging our teaching right now. If the things that we're saying are not in companion with what the Bible teaches, then don't listen to us. Listen to the Bible.
And that one simple little verse that said, and the Bereans were more noble-minded because they searched the scriptures to make sure what they were being taught was correct.
That's right. And that we want to be Berean Christians for sure. We want to do that very thing. So we must make judgments about the things that people are teaching to see if they are true or false speakers. We have a couple other passages. He talks there about the fruit. John 15, verses 1 through 8. Jesus there says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it, so that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away as a branch and dries up, and they gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. So Jesus there, this is in John 15, is Jesus speaking to his disciples in the upper room after the institution of the Lord's Supper, after the Passover has been observed, before they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane. And so it's kind of amongst those final teachings that he has with his disciples before his crucifixion. And he tells them, this whole section is about bearing fruit. And he tells them there specifically a couple of things. First of all, that if you abide in me, you will bear fruit.
Right.
It's not if you abide in me and you feel like it, you'll go do some good things in my name. It's that if you are abiding in me, then it will be evident by the fruit that you bear. And then he also says that the Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit. And that leads us right back to Matthew chapter 5, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks about you're the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth. And he says, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And so bearing fruit is not about, doing things that glorify ourselves or that call attention to ourselves, but all the things that we do in the name of Christ to bring glory to the Father.
And that just brought to mind, thinking about my garden right now, my vines are this big. My cucumber vines, they got 1.5 leaves on them, most of them. There's not a big vine there. It can't produce any fruit. The vine is everywhere. It's huge. So for us to be on that vine, we're not lacking the ability to produce fruit. My vines right now in my garden can't produce any fruit because they're not big enough to have a branch on them.
They've got to grow first.
They've got to grow. God's vine is huge. It's all encompassing, and we're those branches that can produce fruit.
Yeah, that's a good point. you know, we all need to grow. We all need to progress in our faith. We all need to reach, you know, continue to reach higher levels of maturity. But a new Christian, a brand new Christian, is able to produce fruit. A Christian that's been a Christian for 50 years is able to produce fruit. There's not a period of time where it's like, well, I can't produce any fruit right now because I've got to grow first, because we're associated with that vine that
Right.
that is God. So that's a good point. We also have, there's Matthew 12:33 here, 33 through 35. Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak what is good? For the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. The good man brings out of his good treasure what is good, and the evil man brings out of his evil treasure what is evil. I think the interesting thing that we talked about earlier was this is kind of an absolute statement here, where Jesus makes the case that somebody who is steeped in evil, somebody who is pursuing evil, is incapable of saying that which is good. And the example we thought of was, you know, when Jesus is approached by someone who is demon possessed, and the demon says, I know who you are, you're the Son of God. And what does Jesus do? I don't want your testimony. You are a demon, and if you are going to give testimony about who I am, you can't do that properly. So because that demon is evil, Jesus doesn't want them speaking something, even though what they say is true. They say a true statement, but Jesus doesn't want to hear it.
They say a true statement, but there's actions, there's thoughts, there's desires behind that statement that aren't righteous, that aren't good.
Right.
There's, you know, they've got a I can't think of the word. They've got a plan.
Yeah.
And it's not good.
Ulterior motive. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
And so we see that as well in some of the scenes, and we'll see it in the things coming up in this passage. We'll see it in Matthew chapter 25, where, you know, there were people who were out there doing good works. They were doing good things, and they're surprised that they're not saved. But Jesus said those good works didn't amount to anything because your heart wasn't in it. Your heart wasn't in the right place. You were not a righteous person. And so, you know, we like to think sometimes of our salvation being a matter of, there's this scale where as long as my good works outweigh my bad works, I'm going to be okay, and that's not it at all.
Well, it's like giving.
Yeah.
You know, I'm giving more than you, but I hate it. But I'm doing it. It does me no good.
Yeah, I'm not happy about it, but I'm doing it. Right. So, so we have this. You know, we're known by our fruits, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. It can't happen, and a good tree doesn't produce bad fruit. So, so that fits right in with what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount here. Our next section there, verses 21 to 23, fits right in with what we were just talking about. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So this just fits right in with that passage in Matthew chapter 12 that we just read. A bad tree cannot produce good fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit. And so there are going to be those who say, Lord, we were producing good fruit in your name. We were out there doing things in your name. And yet Jesus will look at them and say, you never were part of me. You never were on the narrow road. You never were part of my disciples. And it doesn't matter that they were out there doing things that they believed to be good, because they weren't part of his flock.
There's so many people out there that think, well, I'm okay. I'm doing good things. I'm not
Right.
doing bad things all the time, but
Yeah.
they're not following God. They're
Yeah.
not following Jesus' commands.
And so this fits in with that question at the beginning that we talked about. Is it possible to know God? Is it possible to do good works and still not be saved? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is yes. And that's where a lot of people, that's where a lot of people are going to find themselves on that last day. The notes here say you can believe in him, you can claim him as your Lord, you can do incredible things in his name, and you can still be lost because of disobedience.
I mean, I think of monks and, you know, those convents up in, you know, Italy and Germany, that they're way up there and they've lived their entire life up there and never set foot outside. They're not spreading the light. They're not teaching God's word. You know, they're probably not doing a lot of evil things that a lot of people do, because, you know, there's not a lot you can do in a monastery up on top of a mountain, but it doesn't mean that they're doing what God wants them to do.
Yeah.
And we can still think that we are, and still be worshiping Him in a way that He has not set forth, and still be wrong.
Right.
It's hard to, we absolutely can miss the mark.
And
You know, I think of David, and his reputation is he's a man of God's heart. He did awful things. In adultery, murdered Bathsheba's husband, and yet he ultimately was forgiven and blessed. You know, in his future endeavors. He wasn't a perfect man by any means, but he loved God.
Right.
And you just can't read the Psalms without seeing how he would stray and do the wrong thing from time to time, but he loved God. And the message consistently, I think, from the Sermon on the Mount is about where your heart is. Are you seeking me? Are you looking to put me first in your life?
Right.
Do you love me?
right. This and it again, it goes back to what Jesus said earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, where our righteousness has to surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes and the Pharisees had a long checklist of things that, as long as you did all the things on the checklist, you were fine. We've checked off all the things on the list, and we've held up our end of the bargain, and now God owes us what He said He would give us if we hold up our end of the bargain. And Jesus throws that right back at them here. He says there's going to be people who show up at the last judgment with their checklist, and they're going to have all these checks off their list, and He's going to say, well, I never knew you. Your heart was never in the right place. You were never one of my disciples. And so now, does that mean that obedience is not important? I think it means just the opposite. Obedience is important. We have to obey Him in the way and in the means that He says to do so, not by an artificial means, not by the list that the scribes and the Pharisees had that did not have anything to do with the heart. And so this is not to say that we don't need to go about, we don't prophesy and cast out demons today, but we don't need to. We do need to go out doing the good fruits that He talks about earlier, and those are the deeds of righteousness. But they need to be based on matters of the heart.
And He kept telling the scribes and the Pharisees that the problem is you keep adding to everything. Your list keeps getting longer and longer, and you can't even do it, and you're trying to make other people do it.
And how is it that He says these things, Lord? They say these things, Lord, do we not prophesy in your name? We cast out demons. We perform many mighty miracles. We did all these things, and yet Jesus said, "Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness." Well, how are they practicing lawlessness if they were going about doing all these things that Jesus, or that they claimed they were for Jesus?
I think it comes down to what I'm doing, glorifying God.
Right.
Glorifying me.
Yeah. And we've looked at passages that say that exact thing. And a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. And so if they're doing it, even if they're really doing all these things, even if they are out there doing all of the things they claim to do, if they're a bad tree and they're doing it for the wrong motives, for the wrong reasons, if they're not one of Jesus' disciples, then it doesn't matter what those works were. They cannot be righteous.
Well, He just went through telling them, you can stand on the corner and pray and you're not doing it right. You can fast and you're not doing it right. You're not doing those things, those actions
Right.
correctly.
Go back into chapter 6 and He addresses those things. It's good to fast, it's good to pray, but there are wrong ways to do both of those things. It's good
Correct.
to give.
Yes.
And He talked about all of those things, but there are wrong ways to do those good things. John 1, 1 John 3 and 4 says, everyone who has this hope fixed on him purifies himself just as he is pure. Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. So back in Matthew 7 there, where Jesus said those who practice lawlessness, they are sinners. They are people who practice sin. Not just that they have sinned, but they practice sin. They are steeped in sin. And so, sin is lawlessness, and those who practice lawlessness will not find themselves at the narrow gate.
And we would talk about in James, where you walk in the light as he is in the light, you're cleansed. That doesn't mean that you're not going to sin, because we're all sinners, but we're not practicing that.
Right.
We're not
walking
walking in sin.
Right.
We fall down in it once in a while. We trip over it once in a while. But we're not walking in it. We're not living our lives in that sin.
Right. That's good. The next section there, Matthew 7, verses 24 to 27. Jesus, wrapping up here, says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. That sounds familiar.
Hey.
And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So we know this. We know these words. We know the song. It's not just a song. He's making a point here. He says, therefore. So therefore, as we talk about all the time, goes back. It points backwards. So therefore, because of what I just said, and he in the immediate context has just talked about
Fruits.
The final judgment. Many will say to me on that last day, Lord, Lord. And so, but in the context of the whole sermon, we can go all the way back to the beginning of Matthew chapter 5, and it encompasses everything that he's taught up to this point. The Beatitudes, righteousness that surpasses the Pharisees, light shining, being the salt of the earth, seeking first the kingdom and his righteousness. All of these things are encompassed in this word, therefore. So everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them, so there's a twofold thing here. You have to hear the word, but you have to act on it. You can't just hear it and then walk away unchanged. You have to hear it, and it has to change you. It has to change your behavior. It has to change your life.
James 1:22. But be doers of the word and not hearers only. We've got to do it. We can't just hear it.
Keep going through verse 25.
Okay. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does.
All right. So, we've been looking at the Sermon on the Mount. We're looking at the life of Christ. We study the Scriptures. And the question is, are we doers or are we just hearers? Because if we're just hearers, then Matthew 7:21 comes back to us, where he says, many will say to me on that last day, Lord, Lord, well, we heard what you said. We believed that it was true. We believe you were the Lord. We believe that you're the Son of God, but it didn't change how we lived. It didn't change anything about who we were. And he'll say, depart from me, I did not know you. But if we hear it, and in hearing it, we act on it, we become followers of what he says, then it will change not just who we are in the present, but it will change who we are in the future. It will make us his children. Good. All right. How about 1 Corinthians 3, verses 11 to 14? For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident. For the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire. The fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on remains, he will receive a reward. So it's interesting here that Paul, using a similar analogy about building a house, Jesus used the analogy of, the wise man built his house and then the floods came and they withstood the force of the floods. Paul here uses, the idea of building a house on the foundation which is laid, which is Jesus. There's no other foundation that'll hold up. And if you come along and you build on that foundation and then it is tested by fire, the strength of that house, that structure will be revealed by the fire, by the trials that come. And if it withstands it, because you built on the proper foundation, then you're okay. But if you build on the wrong foundation, then it will not withstand the trials that come.
And that makes me think of Noah and the flood.
Right.
And the end of the earth, which will be by fire.
Okay. Yeah, so the earth will never be destroyed by flood again, but will be destroyed by fire in the age to come. So that's right. If we build upon Christ, we'll be okay.
We'll be okay. We'll be standing there when the fire's over.
Yeah.
Later at 3:16, when Peter makes the confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, when he asks him, "Who do you think I am?" Jesus replied, "That's the rock that I'm going to build your church, build my church on."
Yeah.
And then when Peter did preach the first sermon in Acts 2, and the church began, we saw what that really means for Christ to be the rock. How does that flesh out? What does that really mean to be the rock, the foundation of what we do? And we see that fleshed out in Acts 2 with how the church began, and what they did, and how they taught each other, and how they helped each other.
And then we have it. You're exactly right. So the comment is in Matthew 16, when Peter made the great confession about who Jesus was, Jesus said, "Upon that rock," which is not Peter, it's the truth that Peter confessed, "Upon that rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And then in Acts 2, Peter preaches the first gospel sermon, and the church is formed. And we see that being played out. We see Jesus establishing his church upon the sermon that Peter gives, that Jesus was in fact the Son of God. So it's upon that truth that his church is founded upon on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And then, if I can find it, 2 Peter chapter 2, 1 Peter chapter 2, let me go back to the right Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, "Coming to him as a living stone, rejected by men, but choice and precious in the sight of God. You also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up a spiritual sacrifice acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." And then quoting from the Old Testament, verse 6, "Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone. He who believes in him shall not be disappointed." Then verse 7, "The stone which the builders rejected has become the very cornerstone." And that's Jesus. Jesus was the stone that the builders rejected. Scribes and the Pharisees, religious leaders of the day, rejected him, but yet he was proven by God to be the chief cornerstone, the cornerstone of the new kingdom, the church that he had come to establish. And that is the stone upon which we build. So it all, man, isn't that amazing how it all ties together?
Yes.
It's the same stone that others have been troubled.
Right. He is the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense that others will hear and say, "Well, that can't be right." And they reject him, and they're, that puts them in the broad way. We had another passage that went along with that section, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 19. "Nevertheless, the firm foundation of God stands, having this seal: the Lord knows those who are his, and everyone who names the name of the Lord is to abstain from wickedness." So on that last day, there are those claiming, I've confessed you as Lord. You are my Lord. And Jesus will say, I don't know who you are. The Lord knows who is his.
He has given us the foundation.
Right.
And knows who's standing on it and who's not standing on it.
They're the ones who have built upon the foundation he has given us are his, and the ones who are building upon some other foundation are not his. And there's no mistaking those two.
No.
All right, our last section here, verses 28 and 29. It says, when Jesus finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Can you imagine being in that crowd and hearing the things that Jesus taught?
I mean, we've both heard some good speakers, some good things, but as we talked about earlier, they're referring to someone else who made those comments or made those, we're looking at our scriptures that were written by others for us to teach.
Right.
They come from the Holy Spirit. But Jesus was God talking to them, telling them what was going on and how they should live their lives. And to sit there and understand that this is coming from him. He's not just like the scribes and Pharisees saying, oh, well, you remember Moses said this. Back in chapter 5, over and over and over again, he says, I say. He was teaching from him.
Right.
He was teaching what the Father had given him to teach. As he says, everything I teach comes from the Father. He was teaching God. God was teaching God. And to hear that and to be there and witness that, we look at this, we look back at the people that turned away and walked off after hearing Jesus tell them what they should do, thinking, how could you do that?
Yeah.
But we do it when we read the scriptures.
Yeah. And the idea of authority here in this passage is one that is significant for the entire sermon that Jesus just given. And we've talked about this before, that the Sermon on the Mount, we need to not think of that as like Jesus got up one time and he spoke this sermon, then he sat down and that was kind of all he said on the subject. Think of it as like Jesus' stump speech. As he went into community after community after community, this is what he taught. And it may not have been these exact words every time. It may have been variations of it. But these were the things that he talked about, and he went everywhere teaching these things. And so time and time and time again, crowds had this reaction. And think about in the climate of where he was at with what he was dealing with, the idea of authority. He's going in and challenging the status quo of the religious knowledge and education and teaching of the day. And for somebody to come in and challenge an entire system of belief, you would have to have authority behind that in order to challenge that. You couldn't go in and say, I'm kind of thinking maybe we should try something a little bit different, and it would be kind of cool if we did this, but I don't want to ruffle any feathers. He's going in and he is making a case for changing the way things are done. And in order to do that, you have to speak with authority.
And over again, Jesus tells us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he even had those scribes and Pharisees come up to him and say, we know you teach the truth. I mean,
we don't like it, but we know.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it earlier. There's so many jokes out there about, when somebody's lying because his lips are moving. Jesus told the truth to everybody every time. He didn't change it. His authority was absolute.
Thanks for not naming any names there, by the way. we just continuing on this thought or idea of authority. There's a couple of passages that came to mind in Mark chapter 1. It says Jesus went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath day he entered the synagogue and began to teach. What was it that he began to teach? Probably some very similar things to what he was talking about here on the Sermon on the Mount. Whether it was a portion of that or some similar teachings, things that would have sounded very familiar to us because of our knowledge of the Gospels. So they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And when the scribes taught, scribes, they'd been to preacher school. And when they taught, they would say, well, if a question came up about loving your neighbor, they would quote from Moses, and then they would quote from all the great rabbis that had been before them. They would quote from all the traditional documents and things that they had. And they would say, and now this is what we know about loving your neighbor. And they would not teach us from their own teaching or their own understanding. They would regurgitate things that they had learned. And so Jesus comes in teaching new things with authority, and it amazes the people. Immediately after this, Mark records that there was a demon-possessed man there, and the first thing the demon does is say, I know who you are, you're the Holy One of Israel. And Jesus says, be quiet, I don't need your testimony, come out of it. And the demon comes out, and the people's response to that then, just a few verses later, verses 27 and 28, they were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Immediately the news about him spread everywhere into all the surrounding district of Galilee. And it's amazing to me that in the context of Jesus casting a demon out of somebody, the people were amazed by that. They saw that, they understood it, they knew that that was pretty special. But what sticks in their minds is that signified to them that Jesus had authority that the scribes and Pharisees did not have. And so the authority piece here is not one that we should gloss over or look over. The conclusion of 3 chapters, chapters 5, 6, and 7, of this tremendous teaching, what the people walk away from is saying, wow, this guy has authority. That's huge.
And they came to the synagogues when he showed up to listen to that, to hear it. Because the news spread that this guy is teaching with authority. This guy is teaching the truth, but they didn't necessarily have heard what he was teaching yet.
Right.
So as he went to those different synagogues, he taught them those things, and that's why they showed up.
Right. They showed up to hear him speak with authority. And so, again, let that kind of sink in as you think about, well, maybe we need to water down our message today. Maybe we need to not speak with so much certainty about what the Bible says. Maybe we need to leave room at the edges for a lot of gray area and a lot of differences of opinion and things like that. The people were clamoring for somebody with authority. And I think in a society today where there is a lot of people speaking with a lot of different authorities, I think we need to make sure that our authority is clear, that we're speaking not of our own authority, but we're speaking with the authority of Christ, and that we're teaching the things that he taught in the way that he taught them, because authority gets attention.
Back in the day.
Your day?
Yeah, back in my day, which was before your day.
Yes, it was.
People from the Church of Christ were known as Bible thumpers because we knew the Bible, we knew the scriptures, and we quoted the scriptures, and we told people what the scriptures say. And nowadays, that's a bad thing to be called a Bible thumper, because you're a hater and a hypocrite, and you don't love my sin. Well, no, I don't love your sin, and I'm not going to. The scriptures tell me why.
Call me what you will.
So, maybe we need to get back to thumping the Bible some.
Well, there you go. I like it. And so, just again, kind of as a conclusion to this entire series of lessons that we've looked at through the Sermon on the Mount, the thing that struck the people was the authority with which Jesus spoke. And we need to carry that authority. We don't, You know, we're not Jesus, but we have his words and we have his teaching, and we can understand what he taught, and we can teach that exact same thing, and call people to the same thing that Christ called them to.
The message throughout is, that we have so much hate today, and the only cure for hate really is to know the Lord.
Right.
To know the Lord is to know that we love each other. You can hate the sin and love the sinner.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to get that message across. That the only way we can keep people from killing each other, or going into schools and killing people, or countries killing each other, is for the gospel to get out there that there is a better way.
Yeah.
We'll conquer all of that. And we have to believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. In the stories that we have of individual encounters with Jesus, when individual sinners encounter Jesus, I don't think any of them ever walk away thinking, man, that guy doesn't like me, or that guy hates me. They always walk away from their personal encounters with Jesus. Even when they reject what he says, I think they always walk away from Jesus understanding that he spoke to them with compassion, that he spoke to them with love. And sometimes they did reject what he said. But very often it was because of his compassion for them that he was able to say very difficult things to them, but they walked away with a change in their lives because of his compassion and his love.
What is it that separated the sheep from the goats?
Yeah, they didn't do the things to the least of these the sinners.
I mean, we discussed earlier the fact that people call us haters because we're trying to get them to stop their sins so they can go to heaven. If I hated you, why would I want you to be with me in heaven for eternity? That doesn't make any sense. I love you. That's why I'm trying to get you to be in heaven with me for eternity. Otherwise, I wouldn't be trying to teach you this stuff.
Well,
we made it.
we made it through our first one together.
Yeah, and we didn't run out. We've still got stuff we could talk about. So we did something that you have failed to do on numerous occasions
I've failed on many
with
things.
your
I've
last teammate, which
Failed
was
many
finish the
things
lesson.
on many times. If we're gonna start talking about my failures, we're gonna need more time.
You have a new partner.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go.
All right, any questions? All right, thank you. We'll take up again next week.